Hi, my name is Leo, and today we're going to talk about coding interviews. So first, I'm going to give you a quick agenda. First, we're going to do a quick intro. Then I'll tell you some things I think you should know about coding interviews. And then I'll tell you how to prep, what I think are useful things. We talk about a toolbox, a pattern, some best practices, that sort of thing. Then let's talk real briefly about the right mindset for coding interview and how you can maybe overcome some obstacles, that sort of thing. And in the end, the interview itself, the day off, and a few quick things to note maybe. Cool. First, quick intro. Who's this guy who's talking? I'm Leo. I work as a data scientist at Avanade. Avanade is a daughter company of Accenture and Microsoft. I do mostly data science and machine learning. As the job requires, I do a bit of data engineering here and there, as is required, of course. Machine learning engineer, whatever. I have to be a little flexible there. I also do the company internal trainings for data science together with another person. So that's pretty cool. And I'm getting into the Accenture training as well. So not just Avanade, which is, I don't know how many data scientists, but it's a sizable company, but also getting to the Accenture side of that. It's a lot of fun. I also do technical interviews for Avanade. And I'm also trying to get into evaluating data science project and helping the what we call solutioning, as into is this a valuable data science project, what we require from the client, these sort of things. But I'm just learning that as we go. So I'm not yet a specialist in it, but it's been kind of officially added to my responsibility. So I thought I should mention it. I'm a former SharpestMinds mentee, and now I'm a proud mentor at SharpestMinds. I love SharpestMinds. There's a reason why I'm still here. And I really believe in the community. So I also, having said that, I'm still learning. I'm teaching and learning as much as I can. So if you notice, if I make a mistake, I'm receptive of any kind of feedback. Let me know, and I shall learn from you guys. And feel free to connect with me. Feel free to ask me questions. Feel free to interrupt me if you have questions on the spot. Feel free to wait with your questions, whatever is more comfortable for you. And please, if you have any requests, as in, hey, Leo, you mentioned something, could you do a session and deep dive into this or whatever? If I can, I will try to. So happy for any kind of suggestions like that too, right? Cool. First of all, I think this needs to be said right away. Disclaimer, even though I do coding interviews if required and when required, I don't like them. And there's a reason for that. And I think Ray, who's an amazing mentor in SharpestMinds, shared quite recently a Medium article about why coding interviews aren't a great way to assess senior developers. I would also add that I don't think they're a great way to assess junior developers too. I think they're inherently not great for assessing someone's strengths. I think also, and I have a lot of reason to believe, that coding interviews is a learnable skill that's somewhat removed from your actual day-to-day job. And it doesn't necessarily send the right signals. That being said, however, it's still not too unlikely that I have to do at least a few coding interviews in the foreseeable future. So might as well be prepared. On top of that, I think you can combine learning for coding interviews with ramping up your coding skills. And that's what I'm trying to help you with today. I'm trying to not have you overfit on certain coding interviews, but I will try to just be helpful when it comes to coding, and thus, I think, help you be more successful in coding interviews. Obviously, I also want to give you the advice that I can share with you about coding interviews. Okay, that's not what I says if I was interviewing you in a coding interview. First of all, I think this can't be emphasized enough. Communication, yes, 5 exclamation signs, a sure sign of madness. Oh, quick note. My wife is in the other room currently on video calls too. So if there's any kind of, if I'm lagging or there's an interruption, you don't hear something, it's probably me and not you. So please just interrupt me and ask me to repeat it again. I gladly do so. And I apologize if that ever happens. Okay, good. So communication, that's crucially important, because through your thought process, I want you to talk through your approach. I basically don't want you to be mute for a long time, right? If you need some time to think, which is perfectly fair, tell me. Tell the interviewer, hey, I'd love to think about this for 30 seconds. But the thing I strongly discourage you to do is to just start coding right away without letting me know what you're doing. There's many reasons for that. One reason is, as an interviewer, I'm a potential source of help. That's the first reason. It is, I'm there to help you as well. I know that's not everyone's experience of interviewing. I know there's lots of horror stories out there, and I've personally been in coding interviews where I've looked into a face that said, oh, back on my home planet, we would have thrown you back into the birthing pool, you waste of carbon. But yeah, okay. Most of the time, though, let's just assume you face a decent human being that is there to help you. And from my experience, when I ask other mentors or ask other people who do interviews, even from my experience interviewing, right, as a candidate, you can get help if you ask. And in order to do that, you need to communicate. And you can get help the most efficiently if you let them know which direction you're heading, if you let them know what you're currently stuck on, and so on. So communication is really, really important. And this deserves to be practiced. And later on, we'll go into, I think, quite awesome ways to practice this, okay? What else do I assess? I set thought process in your approach. Also, style, coding style. It's important. I'm sorry, I don't apologize for it either, because your code needs to be read. It needs to be readable. It needs to be understood by other people. A better coding style helps with that. So I will assess it. If your coding style is full of one-word variables that are not readable, that confuse you as the interviewee, then I think that is something you can improve upon, and you should improve upon. And it's also something that is just a good practice for coding, right? Good variable names, that sort of thing. On top of that, fluency, right? How fluent are you writing your code? How comfortable are you? Does it seem like are you just comfortable in whatever language you're coding in right now, right? Do you know your ins and outs? Do you know enough syntax, right? Okay. Prioritizing. What do I mean by that?
Leo,
Yeah, yes.
Sorry, just a quick question on the fluency
Yes.
point.
Yes.
I could imagine being in an interview and then I'm asked, like, I don't know, do some operation on a data set.
Mhm.
And, maybe I can't think of the exact pandas command that would do it, right?
Yes.
And normally I would look it up. And
Yes.
so how do you balance like that threshold? Do you tell your interviewer like, hey, I would normally look this up right now, but
Mhm.
because we're here, I won't. Or like, how do you think about that?
Fantastic. Excellent question. And you already gave half the answer. That is, yeah, you would communicate, hey, I know there is probably a more efficient way, which I will look up at this point. Here's what I try to do. I try to pivot this table, whatever it is you try to do, right? Usually I look up the pandas command and so on. So that's part one. Part two is if it's even better. So that's already good. And I think that's a great first step to take. It's even better if you can add to that. I would be able to code out a brute force approach, say using a nested for loop or something like that, that does the job, but I know that's not the best style. I know that's not the best technique. Would you want me to do the brute force approach just to show you that I can hack, or would you want me to just, tell me what pandas operation is because I forgot, or so on? And I think that's perfectly valid. But I would encourage you to think of these sort of things as, can I brute force my way through, right? Because that shows a skill. And that's something I think that's worth, just think of it as, even though there isn't points that you could collect, it doesn't work like that. But think of it as that way. There's points for every single little thing out there, and try to just grab as many of them as you can, left and right? And one of them is to show that you can hack. So you know that you can hack out just a brute force approach. You can, I know I can iterate through columns. Maybe I can use this or that, or I can just use a nested for loop or whatever it is. Show that. If that's required, at least show that you can show that, right? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Leo.
Cool. Did I go through prioritizing? No, I don't think I did. So prioritizing, what do I mean by that? I mean that you know, at least to a degree, what's the important part of the code that you need to write, right? And honestly, this comes with practice, but this comes just with coding experience. So for example, you get some random question about operations on a data set or whatever it is. Ideally, you know what the heart of the problem is, right? If you do know that, that's just the bonus points. That's just great. And then you also should know that and should show that that's what you think, where you think, and you can ask for feedback here as well, where you should spend the most time. And you should plan that accordingly too, I think. We go through this a little more later and also how to practice that, but I think time management plays into this, right? Not every coding interview will you have the luxury of someone telling you, oh, we're kind of running out of time, we're kind of low on time. Sometimes it's up to you to ask how we're doing time-wise. Should I spend more time on this or so on? Ideally, you also just keep track of your time, but I know how it is. I get extreme tunnel vision, and I forget about time left and right. But you don't need to do as badly as I do when it comes to time management. But you should keep track of these things, right? And so prioritizing is keeping track of your time. Where should you spend your time, and knowing kind of what's the important part of this problem, right? And then general knowledge, right? That's yeah, it's this. Do you know the operations? Do you know the data structures and that sort of thing? We go into more of that later on. And the next one might be controversial, but because many people say, hey, it's not that important that it runs, but I think it's always a bonus point. And I think it's actually a little more than a bonus point, but that's my opinion, and that's why it says how I would assess in a coding interview, right? Because ideally, you get something to run that does the job, and then you can always optimize, right? There is a whole kind of software engineering philosophy behind it, no premature optimization, that sort of thing. Is just get it to run. And yeah, of course, in the real world, you spend some time researching as you go. If you don't know the things, you look up the better operations, and you say, hey, wow, I'm in a way too high space complexity or time complexity. There must be something better I can do. You research it, but if you can show you can just get it to run, I think that's more than a bonus point. I think that's good. However, there's people that will openly disagree with me on that. So just note that there's an asterisk there, right? Cool. If applicable, modular code, testable code, and object-oriented programming. And that means if I see you rewrite similar code and again and again and again, that goes against a clean code principle that is dry, do not repeat yourself, refactor it out. That's at least a bonus point, right? Maybe it's more than a bonus point, especially if it's a longer coding interview or it's yeah, I think it's more than a bonus point, but at least think of it. It's not, again, none of these are like a must, except maybe for communication. And yeah, maybe, but think of it as points that you can leave on the table. Don't leave points on the table when you catch yourself rewriting code, for example, and be like, oh, I can factor it out. It will help me too, right? It will help you because it'll save you time. It'll make it more readable. It's better practice, and it's points. It's extra points. Testable, at least mention that you could test your code, right? We go into this a bit more later. And object-oriented programming, when applicable, yeah, do it. It's just good practice, and it doesn't pollute the namespace, all that sort of thing. At least show that you can mention that, right? At least show that you know about it. And then ideally implement it if time permit and it's applicable, right? Cool.
Sorry, quick
yes.
question/note that you brought up that I've never thought of mentioning explicitly. You said something like, especially if it's a long interview, you should worry about modularity and code quality and so on. I really like that because I've never thought about extracting from the length of the interview itself some clues about what it is that the interviewer is looking for. Could you elaborate just like very briefly on that idea, just in case I'm missing anything there?
Right. Also, this probably varying. First of all, there's a huge variance when it comes to coding interviews out there, right? And I certainly don't mean to generalize to all settings. And some companies require you to use a certain stack. Some companies will very heavily emphasize certain things. And but as you said, I think there can be clues from the coding interview itself, and also from your interviewer, right? And if you notice he's saying, "Oh, okay, you've done something similar before," then yeah, okay, wow, maybe you should think about modularity. Maybe you should refactor, right? If he asks you, "Are you going to refactor?" Probably you should refactor. I'm just suggesting. These sort of things. I don't know if there's more to read between the lines. There probably is. Also, if you see it's like scheduled for like a really long coding interview, do yourself a favor and think about these things first, because it will make your life easier. Having one mammoth function that's as big as the, it doesn't do you any favors. If you can, refactor. It's also good practice. It's something you should practice anyway. So do it.
By the way, Hong is asking, what is refactoring? Sorry, just want to
Great question. Good. So, for example, you see that you have a function that does very, very many different things, right? Now, that's not the best coding practice. That's not best software engineering practice. Ideally, you have a function that does one thing, and that's seen in the name of the function, right? The function should itself be a verb that describes what it does. That's the best style. We'll get to style things a little later too, but I want to elaborate here a bit because I think it's phenomenal. It's a great question. And so when you see a function that does many things, you should immediately think, okay, but how can I rewrite this into one function maybe that just calls the other function and that's its job? And the other functions do the smallest subtasks. I'll give you an example. One example is you do have something that's called data processing. And it's a function that does train test split. It's a function that does missing, smart data imputation. It's a function that does all these things. You shouldn't do that then. You should have a function maybe that's called data processing that calls a function, and that's the refactoring part, that does the train test split, and it's called doing train test split. And another function that calls imputing missing values for X, Y column, right? And the function that does that, right? That's refactoring. Did that answer your question, Hong? I can't see chat, so Jeremy, is that?
He just said yes, thank you.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. Great question. So yes, if you see yourself writing mammoth functions, refactor. It's just also good practice, and it will make your life easy also when it comes to debugging. And we'll speak more about debugging in a minute. But it's something where I think it's more than just bonus points, right? That being said, though, I want to say one thing, and that is I am giving you a lot of advice here, but I don't mean to intimidate you so that you think, oh, all my competition knows this and I don't. That's not the case, especially for entry positions, for data scientists or different other jobs. You don't expect them to be perfect data scientists and perfect software engineers when you go for an entry-level position. That's just not the case. What I'm talking about here is how can you maximize your chances for a coding interview, and how can you, by the way, potentially also pick up some good practices that we go through today, right? But you shouldn't see this as something like, oh my God, there's all these things I need to know tomorrow. This should be more of a, oh, interesting, I hadn't thought of this. Maybe there's something else I can do to maximize my chances for the next coding interview, right? Hope that helps. Should have said this earlier, probably. Cool.
Actually, just to quickly piggyback on that at a statistical level, that is absolutely true. The vast majority of people who get hired through SharpestMinds, first job, and when we talk to them, it's like really clear they'll have like a couple of these things down, but they won't all know, what modularity means, what testable, test-driven development is, what OOP is. Like that's, anyway, sorry. Just wanted to...
Yeah. No, that's absolutely fair. And that is absolutely true. And when you see yourself, competing, especially for entry-level positions, I think you shouldn't, don't worry too much about that stuff. That being said, I think these can be low-hanging fruit, and especially these are some of the things maybe where some of these office hours can help you with, and just show that even if you haven't mastered some of these things, that you know about them, that you've shown the initiative to do some research on them, that you try to follow these practices, and even in an interview, just to be completely honest, if someone doesn't follow best practices, but then stops at some point and just says, oh, by the way, I know this isn't best practice. I know usually I should write better variable names and so on. That's a bonus point. It isn't as good as if the candidate had actually done that, but it's better than being ignorant of that fact, right? So, take all of this in if you can and see what of this you want to work on. I also think we'll spend some time later on, and I think what's good ROI for you. But some of these are pretty low-hanging fruit. And yes, but don't think that you need to know all of this for every interview. That's not, Jeremy pointed it out. That's absolutely correct. Cool. Other questions? Yeah? Okay. It's hard to self-assess how well you're doing in a coding interview. It's also hard to self-assess when you're studying coding. I think that's a fact. From what I've seen, from how candidates reacted, when following up with them, my gut feelings when I was interviewing, and both on both sides, it's hard to self-assess. So my highest recommendation when practicing coding interviews, or just coding in general, some things are great, is practice with other people. Do coders interviews with each other. Maybe you can ask a mentor to do one with you, something like that, or reach out to people. There's just practice with other people. Also practice ideas about that, as in, hey, would you mind looking over my code, or hey, would you mind giving me feedback on this, these sort of things, right? Especially if other mentees, I think that's phenomenal. You're probably sitting in a similar boat. And yeah, another thing you can do is record yourself from practicing. It'll allow you for two things. First is it'll allow you for an honest review after it's done, and allow you to assess how you're spending on, where you're spending your time, what you're spending your time on, right? What's your time management like? That can be pretty important in a coding interview, right? Not every interviewer will be like, okay, like maybe you should move on to the next part. Don't overthink this part. It's okay. Let's assume it works. Let's go to the next part, right? Not everyone will do this for you. And then you write perfect code for the first third of the coding interview, but it was just the first third, and then the coding interview is over and you didn't even notice how time flew by. So in order to get better at that, it's practice, and you can record yourself while practicing. I think that's something. A few things to consider quickly. One is, what language should you interview in? If you say Python, sure, that can be the correct answer if that's the language you know the best. Python is obviously one of the most common. It's the most common data science language. It's omnipresent, but that doesn't mean it must be your number one choice. If you are more familiar in R, and especially if the company that you're applying for is working in R a lot, if you can see that from this stack, then ask to do it in R, no problem. But I'd really highly recommend you interview in the language that you're the most comfortable in. If you have the luxury of being, multilingual when it comes to coding languages, and you can choose, yeah, maybe then choose the one that the company is using the most. But your first thought should be, what am I most comfortable in? Yeah. I want you to prepare for coding interviews by, first of all, getting better at coding. I think there's a thing such as overfitting for coding interviews, and that's not too helpful. And we'll talk a bit about that later. But ideally, you practice clean code, you practice good coding styles, and you practice fluency, and you practice with the libraries and with vanilla Python and all that sort of thing. And you don't practice specifically certain subparts that we'll talk about later that come in handy for interviews, but are not. Because I don't think that's the most efficient ROI, but it's my opinion here. You might never have to do a single coding interview. Great, but chances are you might have to. So just know that you might not have to ever do a single coding interview, but I think you can seriously think about ramping up your coding game, especially in a professional production environment. You'll be a lot more popular if you write good code, right? And if you're going in as an entry-level data scientist, that's not expected. People expect you to learn and grow and pick up better practices as you progress. But yeah, this is stuff that just helps you. So better coding always helps. It'll also save you time. It'll also make your life easier, right? These best practices, sorry, I don't want to digress for too long, but coding best practices, data science might be a really new field, but software engineering is a lot more mature. And many of these practices have been tried and tested on good practices and good style for a reason. Don't miss an opportunity on something like reading the Google style guide, on just seeing how do the pros of the pros do it. What can I learn from just their style, right? I think that's something you can always grow on and improve upon. And it's more than bonus points, especially later on when you're at a job. You're not expected to know it perfectly, but if you already come in with cleaner code than other people at your level, it's great. Cool. How to prep your technical skills, and we'll get into quite a bit of detail in this, and I want you to understand my thinking behind it. But first thing is practice coding, right? And not just data challenges, I would say, but also something like Code Wars. I think data challenges are great, but something like Code Wars is great to train slightly different things, and you should not miss out on the opportunity, I'd say. And okay, so how would you practice for Code Wars? Set yourself a timer, key question, solutions, comments, everything. We'll go through an example in a bit. The thing to notice is practice in the right environment. If you know you're going to have your interview in the calmest room of your house with the most stable Wi-Fi connection, then that's where you should practice too. Don't distract yourself by changing environments the day of the interview. If you're going to have your interview in the kitchen, then that's where you should practice, right? It's special times right now. It's not like we can go in and do a coding interview in-house. Unfortunately, hopefully these days will return soon enough. But as of right now, just make your life easier by just eliminating all the other possible distractions. Cracking the coding interview is a useful resource, but don't get lost in it. Think more of it as how to cover some of the basics, and it's out there. It's useful. I have seen specific data science interview books and stuff, but none of them, sorry to say, were that great so far. Like, if someone knows a good one, I'd love to see it and go through it. I've seen some that I thought were really bad, so I'm not going to even mention them here. And of course, mentees and YouTube. There are good resources out there, and we can share them later on as well. Cool. Study with a linter. A linter is in an IDE, in a one of these more fancy editors such as Atom and so on. You can get linters that will help you pick up better coding styles and help you with your code, and will highlight syntax highlighting. It will highlight errors. It can already pick up on errors and that sort of thing. And I encourage you to study a bit with a linter, right? Get, if you don't have that yet, get one of these IDEs. That's something useful to pick up anyway. But don't dig too deep into an IDE that you can spend a lot of time into that. But maybe get like something like Atom, install some Python linters, and just see, what does Atom suggest I should do different with Python code, right? And also practice, if you haven't yet, getting to write some of the scripts that aren't in a Jupyter notebook. So you force yourself to write code that runs top to bottom. And then study without a linter. Do both. And the reason you should study with a linter, I just went through, and study without a linter because many coding interviews, you won't have linters. So ideally, you will have picked up some of these clean code practices, but you won't rely on your linter to show them to you. OK. Whoops, did I duplicate this? I'm going the wrong way? Oh, I pressed the wrong button. Yeah, OK. Example, how to practice with Code Wars. Cool. Code Wars is one of these sites like HackerRank or whatever. It's just one of the, pick one of them. It doesn't really matter which ones. I like Code Wars because you can practice different languages, and it's something I like to do, but you don't have to. It's just an example, right? How to practice with Code Wars. Example. First of all, start easy, right? Get more practice in rather than the too tough questions right away. First of all, motivate yourself. Don't demotivate yourself. Don't do like one of the hardest questions and then suffer endlessly and think, oh my God, have the self-doubt kicking. Doesn't help. Trust me, I've done that. So do some of the easy ones first. And in the beginning, especially, you want to have more easy questions and solutions under your hood than a few hard ones. And for a couple of reasons. First is you'll pick up a lot of different techniques by doing some of the easy ones. Especially, I think on Code Wars, it does a quite good job in like showing you different things that you can use by looking at other people's solutions, et cetera, and also just by doing them. And on the other hand is that, as probably most of you will go for some more entry-level positions, you won't be, it's unlikely you'll get some of the super hard ones. And if you do get one of the hard ones, so first start off with a lot of easy ones. My recommendation, again, people might have different opinions. And then later on, as you study more or as you become more experienced, mix in a few hard ones, right? If you get a really hard one in a coding interview, first of all, it's a bit of a lottery that happens. But then maybe if it's a really hard one, and I notice, maybe you're not expected to completely answer it the full way. And what I mean by that is having a brute force approach that has a horrible space and time complexity might be perfectly fine, right? There is coding interviews like this. And then it's up to you to show the potential for bonus points, but saying, hey, but I know if I did this with a hash table instead of this, or if I did this with this approach instead of that, I could reduce space complexity because of blah, blah, blah. That's bonus points. That's not expected of an entry-level position. But that's what can put you ahead of your competition. But you can't expect that of your competition, right? That's not realistic. Don't think you need to know all of that. Set yourself a timer for each Code Wars problem and experiment with it. Maybe you should start with okay, do some hard ones. Try the first one in an hour, then try it in 45 minutes, and see how you're doing with time, right? Maybe you can pause yourself and see, okay, how did I spend my time so far? And when the timer beeps and it's up, and I really mean a timer. I have a timer next to my computer, an analog one, and I use it also for studying, as some of you might remember. I think I've gone through studying techniques a while ago. But use that, right? Use things like that. It can be a phone. It doesn't have to be, but use it to stop yourself and then reflect. How did I spend my time, right? Cool. Code words will let you look at other people's solutions once you've either completed it successfully or forfeited the points. You can always forfeit the points. No one cares about the points. And then you can look at other people's solutions, and you have to take some of these with a grain of salt. Some of these solutions are garbage. Some of them are really cool. But it never hurts to scroll through them and think, oh, here's something I've never seen before. Maybe that's worth looking up. Maybe it's worth adding to my toolbox. We'll talk about a toolbox in a second. No code golf. When I talk about garbage in code, especially code golf, if you do write one-liners in a coding interview or ever on production, if you write one-liners, if I have to do a code review and I see one-liners, you'll go to the 12th hell and write JavaScript until the end of time. It's not, no one-liners. Your code is meant to be readable. That's a lot of software engineering is about how your code is getting more read than executed. Maybe not, but it gets read a lot. It gets reviewed. Write code that is readable, and one-liners are never, ever readable. People think it's a sport to do code golf and write everything in one line, and they feel fancy. And whatever, everyone has hobbies, right? But you don't do that.
Question.
Yeah,
sorry,
go ahead.
Jeremy's asking if you can give some examples of terrible one-liners, and sort of more generally, like what do you mean by one-liner, I guess?
Okay, right. So you do many operations in one line. So you do pivot the table, missing values, da 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 da. Imagine you just write it in one line. It goes longer. It chains function after function after function after function after function. That's a one-liner. It can solve your coding. It can be the solution to your coding exercise, but it's terrible practice, right? Maybe you have time later on to open up CodeWords and I show you one-liner or something. But yeah.
Oh, sorry. And just to be clear, it's terrible practice because of the readability angle.
Readability is garbage. Yes.
Yeah. Great. Thanks.
And
Jeremy says thanks.
Cool. Awesome. Sweet. Yeah. And as always, feel free to interrupt. Thanks. Good question. Yeah, I would also encourage you to take notes about everything, right? Take notes about how you spend time on, take notes about the things you learned from a CodeWords exercise, such as, hey, I used default dict, or I used set, or I used string functions, whatever. Take notes. Build a repo of your solutions so you can review it. So you can also reiterate for you, oh, yeah, I remember this technique that I used here. That was really cool. Or you can also write notes about what you got stuck on. Like, I lost 10 minutes because I didn't properly indent this. Write it down. Write it into your documentation for yourself. You don't have to make this a public repo, but I'm just saying for yourself, keep that stuff. And then I think you'll be less likely to make that mistake again, right? And these sort of things. But grow from your mistakes. You will all make mistakes, right? But try not to make the same mistakes too often. And I think there's so many things happening maybe in a coding challenge that you can take the time and reflecting upon it, taking notes. What did I lose time on? What did I do brute force that can be optimized, and sort of thing, right? Cool. Record yourself. I mentioned that earlier. Check how you spend your time. And then reiterate on some problems that you've done a while ago. So you've done, I don't know, like anagrams or whatever one of these things on CodeWords. There's 1,000 iterations, and we go through it later, of the same similar questions. But do the very same questions that you did a while ago for two reasons. First is maybe you've learned new things that will make it more efficient. Maybe you've now learned better practices. Keep both versions. And so the first reason is now you can see how maybe you get stuck on different things the second time. Maybe you don't get stuck at all and whatever. But it's two reasons, such as that. First is it'll show your own growth, and that's important too. Confidence is a thing, especially in coding interviews. You should have a resilience to not getting derailed, to not getting you panic too much. That you don't panic too much when you get stuck. We talk a bit about this in a second too. So if you reiterate through some of them, you can see, oh yeah, now it's much quicker. I've learned those things, and da da da. But give yourself a bit of time, like the whole spaced repetition thing that I keep talking about. Don't do it the next day. Maybe do it like a week and a half from then when you've done it, and you're just like, oh, that was an interesting one. I bet I can do it in 10 minutes now. And then time yourself, right? Cool. How to practice with others. I think this is a really important part. You can do code wars together. Why not team up? You can share screens and do code wars together. I think that's phenomenal. I think that's great. You can exchange ideas. You can exchange best practices. You can give yourself feedback as you do. You can just think about a problem together. Use CodePad, and then one person can interview the other, and then you can swap, right? CodePad is CoderPad. I misspelled it, I think. Is one tool that's getting used a lot for coding interviews. If you've already used it a few times, you won't get shocked by it. It also doesn't have linters. It doesn't have autocomplete. So if you've practiced a bit with it, you won't get thrown off by the fact that it doesn't have autocomplete and these sort of things. So yeah. And then review after you've done your coding interview with another person. Give honest and constructive feedback, and just don't rush off to do the next one or the next thing. Think about how it went, give yourself constructive feedback. What could you have done differently? What could you have done better? And so on, right? If not, if you don't know how to solve a problem, it's probably an opportunity for growth, right? Share it on Slack. Maybe someone wants to join in. Maybe someone has done something similar. Maybe someone knows how to give you a hint without giving the solution away, that sort of thing, right? But if you get stuck completely, you can also forfeit the points and code wars and look at the solutions and maybe a bit, oh, yes, that's interesting. Or it's something like, oh my God, you needed to use that data structure. Maybe we chose too hard of a problem. Fine. You don't need to know that. We get to that later. But yeah, it's always fair to forfeit points and go for another question if you get stuck and you see the solution. It's like, whatever. I don't think I need to know this. Help each other, right? I think this is great about this community. There's a lot of very helpful people in here. And I've certainly learned a lot from all these amazing people on it. And so, yeah, you can help each other. Maybe someone knows a trick or two that you don't. Maybe you can help someone else with a trick or two that you don't, that someone else doesn't know. So that sort of thing. Something worth trying, I want to mention this. It's called pair programming. I don't see it as often in data science as I do see it in web development and other areas of software engineering. I don't see that often in data science, but it's pretty cool. So what's pair programming? If you don't know, it's two people work on the same code. There's a driver, and there's only one keyboard. Of course, nowadays we do it virtual, but whatever. Same philosophy applies. Only one person will type the code, and the other one will tell the other person what code to write. So an example is, I want you to iterate through the indices and elements of the word list, blah, 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 instead of you dictating for L and index in da, 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 da. No. This is great because it allows you to practice talking about code. The better you know how to talk about code, the easier a coding challenge will be for you. And of course, it'll make your life easier once you're somewhere and you need to talk about code. It's a skill that you can pick up. It's nothing to be intimidated by. It's worth practicing, though. I think pair programming is worth practicing, even though it's unlikely you'll find it in a lot of data science roles. If you go for other roles, it's more likely that you'll find it. But I think it's a great option to think about when practicing coding and practicing how to talk about code. And then, so one person dictates what code, does not dictate, tells the other person what code to write, and the other person then writes that code. And I don't mean this in a kind of like, oh, that one person is the boss and the other person is no. You're a team, you still work together. So if the other person says, yeah, I can do that, but honestly, wouldn't you want to think about it this way? Can't we do that? Then yeah, you talk about this. This is part of the exercise, right? But think about it, pair programming. You two work on one code, right? Not you two on the same problem on different lines of code. No, you two work on the same lines of code all the time. Pair programming is, I think, something worth considering. There are very big companies that are being run by people that I know some people, some leaders in there that really believe in it a lot and have their departments practice pair programming a lot. I, again, don't think these are mostly data science departments, but who knows? Maybe it'll be more common in data science, but I've seen it. It's not easy. It's something you'll have to learn. But since it isn't easy, it's probably, if it isn't easy for you, it's probably a signal on why is something maybe worth investing in, right? It's investing into your skills of how to talk about code. And that will help you not just with coding interviews, but with your life as a data scientist, machine learning engineer, data engineer, whatever. It will. Cool. A toolbox. I mentioned toolbox. What do I mean by a toolbox? A toolbox is a little repository that you write, or it can be a Word document, whatever. I like it to be a repository of a collection of all these useful functions that you write, or just shortcuts or data structures, anything you come across that you learn while learning how to code a little better. And then you can think of that as your go-to kit, right? Your little toolbox. I am in an interview, I'm in a tough situation, but I have a toolbox prepared. I know that if I need unique elements of a list, I can do it with set list. Done, right? Or if you know that missing keys is an issue, you have used default dict. Or if you know, oh, okay, I know some string functions, I've done whatever, that becomes part of your toolkit. You'll build it over time. You'll add to it. It grows. And then every once in a while, you just look at it. You don't need to like go through it religiously, but you just look at it, and that'll serve two things. First of all, it'll grow your skill set in coding, just coding. But also, it'll grow your confidence, and it'll make you more resilient to the stress. Because assume this, you're in a situation, and I guarantee you this happens in most interviews, and you get stuck. You can think, okay, I'm stuck, but I have a toolbox. What's in my toolbox? Oh, I've used this and this and this. That's not useful. This not useful. Oh, I've used that, and that might just be it. And even if you don't find anything in that toolbox, it's the fact that you have that. You know that you've prepared for this, things like this. And you can talk about this to the interviewer too when you get stuck, and we'll get to this in a moment. But it'll help you with that. Cool. Examples of what to put in a toolbox, I already mentioned a few. Set, and then you write a little comment in your repository, in your Word doc, what it does, default dict, and so on and so on. There's a lot of things. It's up to you what you put in the toolbox. It can be a function that you write every time you do some operation, right? Just, oh, here's how I iterate through something and do some sort. It can be whatever you want it to be. Whatever you factor out, again, Hong, listen, whatever you factor out, maybe that goes into a toolbox sometimes if you do these things often. And also your toolbox can become useful in your job because, for example, if you know, okay, these are things I do all the time in pandas and so on, you just have a document. And even by you creating that document, you become more fluent in it. And if you get stuck, you know how to look it up, the syntax real quick, right? Cool.
Sorry, quick question about this.
Yes.
I'm
yes.
curious about your own data science flow. I've heard from a lot of experienced data scientists that, I mean, I do this myself. Like, I'll have a library file with, I call it my toolbox, but I think it's a slightly different concept where I'll have functions that I use a lot, like to parse SharpestMinds data when I'm digging into our stuff, and like. It's almost like its own library that, like scikit-learn, but it's specific to the kinds of problems
absolutely
I solve.
Right.
Oh, is that something that you do as well, or?
Yeah, a little Python library, a little Python module, right? It's just the same as if you import pandas. As you import your own file, it needs to be a Python file. I think that's a great suggestion. I didn't include it here because it's nothing you can do in a coding interview, but it's absolutely something that goes along the line of the toolbox. Why not make your toolbox into a file you can import? Then, of course, be aware of namespace issues, right? Make sure that, maybe then there's some OOP you need to do or something. But yeah, it's a phenomenal suggestion. I highly encourage everyone to do it. It's something really cool on the job as well. Yeah, I didn't mention it here, but I definitely have to smile right now because, yeah, absolutely. Great suggestion. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah, no problem.
Patterns. Good. A lot of coding interviews is pattern recognition. As in, there's 1,000,001 iterations of pretty much the same problem out there, like different takes on it or like slightly different twists to it or whatever. There's Fibonacci, then there's Tribonacci, and then there's Fibonacci where you're not allowed to use a certain thing or whatever, these sort of things. The more you practice, the better you get at recognizing those patterns. What I do recommend you to do is also you keep notes about the patterns that you see emerge, right? So, hey, this had a binary search approach. This was easily solved with a hash table. This was nothing but some matrix math and so on. We'll get into a bit more detail later on there, but just know that a lot of it is pattern recognition, right? I think some of the people who are the best at coding interviews go in and see, I know this is just something you could do either this way or that way. I've seen a take on this. That's an interesting twist. I haven't seen a twist before, but I know that with a hash table lookup approach and I can do this in like 10 minutes. That's because they immediately set a pattern and so on. And you do not need to be at that level. But the more you can get familiar with some of these patterns, at least, it'll just make your life easier for coding interviews. This is for coding interviews, but also it might help you with some of these software engineering skills, right? Where it's always useful to know a bit about some stuff. But actually, I'll go into that in a slide or two. So we're going through that. Actually, that was the next slide. I think there's no excuse to not know any of these things on this slide. Things I think you should always know, not just for coding interviews, but just as a data person, right? And basics of big O. I don't mean you need to know it as well as someone with a PhD in, optimization of software or blah, whatever, but the basics, right? The basics of big O, of time complexity, of space complexity, is something that's a low-hanging fruit. It's also something that at some point, sooner or later, you need to know it, because you need to know with either the data engineers, or it's your responsibility to not be completely wasteful of resources. And so why not two birds, one stone, know a bit about it before coding interview. For example, if you're in a coding interview and you know that your brute force triple nested for loop isn't the most efficient solution, you can say, yeah, I know this is space complexity of n cubed, but its approach, it will work. And I can't think of right now of a more efficient way of doing it. Maybe there's a we can think about that together or something. But just you mentioned big O, right? Some people who will compete with you won't even know what that is. That's fine. Low-hanging fruit for you right there. One of these extra bonus points, right? Later on in your job, I think it's you need to know that stuff anyway. So might as well pick up the low-hanging fruit right now, right? Cool. Object-oriented programming. I think that's a must. Not to the degree where you need to be a master in the metaprogramming and abstract classes and that sort of thing. No, but know the basics of classes. Know initialize functions. Know that sort of thing. Know how to keep your namespace relatively clean, that sort of thing, right? Know a bit about scope. Reference versus value, passing, yeah, that's just no excuse not to notice. Might as well pick up this now. Don't overthink it too much. You don't need to go into C++ and, C and C++, whatever, and go look at dangling pointers and whatever. No, just the basic concept, right? Get that down and know it. And then also, that can help you with coding interviews. That's like my thinking here is these are things you should probably know anyway, but these can help you with coding interviews quite well, right? Because there are some of these things that I see in coding interviews again and again where, why is all of this coming back as the same list? Could it be because it's passed by reference and not passed by value? Then cool. If you know that, and if you see that, and even if you don't know how to solve it right away, if you just say, I think I see what's the problem here. It's being passed by reference, not passed by value. Then you get so much more likely to get that help, to get you unstuck. And it shows that you've done a bit of extra research. Another bonus point, right? Why not? Basics of unit testing, don't overthink it. At least do a bit about this. I have a feeling we might have a presentation about this some point in the future, but might be worth looking into it. Especially when going more into machine learning engineering, data engineering roles, there's no way around it. If that's stuff that you're interested in, it might kind of help you with a coding interview if you can, again, it's a bonus point here or there. Debugging practices, that's not a bonus point. That's crucial. And that's also something that will make your life a lot easier, right? Do you know how to debug the essentials? Do you know how to use some debugging tools? Do you know the flow? Do you know the scope? Do you know what gets called in which order and these sort of things? So that all goes with debugging practices. Practice will make you progress here. This will help you immensely in coding interviews. This is one of the things that'll help you the most, I guess.
A quick
Yes?
question on debugging tools. So
Yes.
Jeremy posted the comment. I think he was joking. He said like print statements, basically like print, which I think is a lot of people's go-to. When you talk about debugging tools, do you have any specific ones in mind that people should look at?
Yes. Maybe we can share that later in the Slack. There are specific ones, and there are quite a list of them. But come back to the print statements. Indeed, maybe you won't have access to any debugging tools as you do the coding interview, and print statements are indeed something to go to. One of your first go-tos. Then there's other practice, other approaches, like the binary search approach. That's what I call it. I don't think it's called that way, but I'll describe it to you real quick. As into, you have a code, and you have an error. You don't know where it came from. You comment out half your code. Is the error still there? Yeah. You comment out half of the code that's remaining. Is it there? No, it's not. Okay, go back to the half that you just commented out. Iterate on it, right? Things like that. These are things to pick up that will just make your life easier and really help you in a coding interview, right? we'll talk about the specific debugging tools later. Kind of running out of time, so I want to move a little forward. But yes, so let's share some tools about debugging. I think that's really useful. I think it's underused even by senior data scientists and data engineers. I see a lot of people stare at code and not make any progress. And you're like throwing your hands up like, really? Whatever. Definitely never going to point any fingers here. Basic software engineering principles. Yeah, right. Modular code. Do not repeat yourself. Clean variable names, descriptive function names, class names that make sense, that sort of stuff. That make life easier. That's kind of requested as you progress from an entry-level position to a more senior position. I don't think as a data scientist for medium-sized company, you can get away without writing good code, and thus you need to know basic software engineering principles. That's nothing you need to internalize every chapter in the book as an entry-level position, but why not pick up some basics right now? Have that help you in a coding interview if you get one, and make yourself a little more popular when you get that job, right? Basics of SQLs, no way around it. I don't think a chance that in the next 15 years, you will not have a situation where you will need to know SQL, and maybe even more than the basics, but definitely the basics, right? Don't overthink it. You can practice SQL on SQL Zoo. You can practice SQL on the Code Wars even. There's different other ways. You can ask people to help you SQL on Slack channel, but a basic SQL is really, it's just expected, and it's a must pretty much. There's even coding challenges where you do SQL, so yes. Things you couldn't go, yeah, is there a question? Oh, I thought I heard something. Things you could know, don't obsess about. Recursion. Why do I make a specific emphasis on this? It is because it's one of those things that you see a lot in coding challenges, which I think is bad, because in your day-to-day life, recursion is often bad practice. Sometimes it is the most elegant solution, but sometimes it's a trap. So know what recursion is. Maybe look at a couple of functions and do an exercise where you write down the stack of operations for recursion. Do it at least once, and then say, okay, now I know what recursion is. I know why it's great and why it's not great, and then you don't need to obsess about it, right? Meta programming. Yeah, okay. Maybe that's something you're already really familiar with. Maybe that's something you're not familiar with. Don't obsess about it. Know what it is, and know what options you have in your different languages that you use. Don't spend too much time on it. Even I know maybe if that is, there's the off chance you'll get this in a coding interview and he's like, I'm sorry, I haven't done this too much. But it might not be to have the best ROI of your time right now, right? You could be studying other things. Let's be real. You could be studying some of these things, or you could be studying other things. Let's focus on what really gets you ahead. Advanced data structures. Okay, wait. Okay, you should know the basic data structures, right? You don't need to know all the advanced data structures. Yeah, so arrays, hash tables, that sort of thing doesn't just make your life easier. It's also your data scientist data structures. You're not a backend engineer who's been in the industry 15 years, who knows every arbitrary random data structure that lets you fly through any coding interview. That's not a good spend of your time, in my opinion. But you should know the basics. Don't bother about the super advanced ones. Yeah. Same thing with super advanced computer science algorithms. Yeah, I don't think you need to know them too well. You can skim through one of these. Okay, I can't find it. I thought I'd put it next to me earlier. There's the classics about algorithms, the classic books about algorithms. Yeah, sure, skim through them if you want to. Don't obsess about it. You can be studying other things. Search algorithms. Maybe write out a couple of them. I think that's cool, but don't obsess about it. I know that there will be the coding interview where, this will be super handy, but you could also be studying other things. This is just my opinion again. And search algorithms is certainly something that is also, it's just too close to data to not be ever looked at by you, I think. Soft skills, and I might be running out of time. Okay, I'll fly through this. Practice interviews, right? Ask for feedback, record yourself, give yourself feedback, be honest with yourself. Pair programming, I think, again, I just want to mention it again. I think that's something where you can really practice the soft skills of coding. Practice presentations, because even though you think, how is that related? Because if you practice a presentation, maybe it has some code in and you need to explain what the code does. I think that's great. It's also a great incentive to write really clean code if you show it to other people, isn't it? Be comfortable being uncomfortable. I keep on saying this. I really believe in it. I think the more you practice in these pressure situations, the more likely you'll be to succeed. A coding interview is an extreme pressure situation, in my opinion. And so the more you've been in similar situation, the less likely you are to have a panic attack, right? Public speaking classes, if that's something you want to spend time and money in, it never hurts, because in many data science jobs, communication skills are something that's really important anyway. How to prep MISC. This is something I, could go into any interview prep, not necessarily coding one, but remember that in the coding interview, you'll also be assessed as a coworker, not just your coding skills, right? So things as, do you show interest in the company? Do you show interest in the product? Do you do your research that you kind of thought about what could, if there's like a data question that you thought about and it comes up in a coding interview, you'll love it. You'll already be a superstar just for having done that research. Even if you don't do that well, if you said, oh, awesome, I looked at this before, there's something I thought could come up because da-da-da and this, and here's a business case in a business, da-da-da and da-da-da. They will listen to every word you say and think, here's someone who does the homework, here's someone who shows passion, and they'll be a lot more forgiving if you don't remember the syntax of something or so on, okay? Cool, other interviews, right? Always a good way to prep. Interviewing mindset, I've mentioned this before, so I'm not really gonna go spend too much time on it. For coding interviews themselves, one thing I do wanna mention is that it's a high pressure situation. And I know this from personal experience, I've butchered coding interviews, right? It happens. I've butchered them for different reasons. One was because I prepared the wrong things and then panicked. Another one is because I panicked, just period, no reason to panic, but I panicked. And two things I want to say about this. One is you will get better by just practice, and it will be also a learning curve of doing coding interviews, and so you can look at it with optimism. You should know from your past mistakes. So just try not to make the same mistakes again. But, and I really want to emphasize this, forgive yourself. Everyone's allowed to make mistakes. You don't have to nail your very first interview that you ever do. Coding interviews are, as I said in the very beginning, I don't think a super amazing way to assess your strengths anyway. A failed coding interview does not mean you don't have what it takes to be an awesome data scientist, right? And have some faith in yourself. Give yourself the permission to completely screw some of these up, learn from them, and move on, right? And ask for help. If you think you continue struggling with coding interviews, ask for help. Don't lock yourself into a room, keep on practicing the same thing, but ask for internal feedback. As I said earlier, it's pretty hard to self-assess some of these things. Yeah, ask for help. Real quick, coding interview strategies. I've probably mentioned most of this before. Real quick, I want to highlight this again. Time management. Keep on track. Ask about how you're doing time-wise. Ask for feedback during the coding interview generally, right? Make it easy for the interviewer to help you. And then ask if there is another approach that you should take. Ask if you should do the brute force approach, if you just walk them through a brute force approach, because maybe they don't want to see it. So for example, if it's like, hey, you can solve this with a triple nested for loop, you can say, hey, I can do it that way, or would you want me to do something else? But then I would have to think about it first, right? Give them the option. Let them choose. And if you only know the brute force approach, yeah, just offer to do it. And maybe that's something they want to see, is how can you hack it together, right? I've just said this. Don't panic. During the interview, things will break. Your code will get stuck. Debugging is expected. It's completely fine. It's 100% okay to say, oh, I need to think about this for 30 seconds. And here's another tip. If you notice that you're panicking, right? Say, oh, I'd like to think about this for 30 seconds. And then I know how it is. You don't need to think about anything. You can just say, breathe, inhale, exhale, see if you can calm down. And then see if you can get yourself back into the process. If that doesn't work, you can always say, hey, I'm really sorry, but I need to go to the bathroom for 1 minute. Would you mind if I just stayed online and ran to the bathroom real quick? You go to the bathroom, you splash some water in the face, you do a breathing exercise, and see if you can salvage it. If it doesn't, and if you screw it up, it's okay. There'll be other ones, right? And coding interviews are tough. It's a fact, as in, it's not. It's just what it is, right? Okay, and also there's an element of luck. You do get the occasional person that should not ever be an interviewer, who just doesn't care about the candidates, who is just misanthropic, who just doesn't like human beings to begin with, and should never ever be let loose on someone who's trying to break into industry, who's giving their all. And so there's that. Then there's the luck of what question do you get, even from a company that has a set of questions. Some are harder than others. If you get the hardest one and your interview isn't aware that it is the hardest one, because let's face it, interviews have a lot of responsibilities, not just interviewing. There's an element of luck there. So be forgiving of yourself when you not do as well as you wish you would have. And yeah, the day of the coding interview, get enough sleep, have a checklist such as, hey, this is just something that I do, and I'm sharing this with you. Maybe you find it useful, maybe you don't need it. I certainly need it, and I profit hugely from it, such as, hey, did you set up the environment? Did you do a sound check? Did you take your prescriptions? Did you have enough coffee? All these kind of things. Did you remember to eat? Yes, that's on my list. And these sort of things. It helps me. Maybe it'll help you too. It's just an idea. And then I highly recommend doing a warm-up. And that is an easy coding exercise. That isn't the hardest one you can find on the course. It's not a kata level 3 or something like that. It's something to get the muscle memory going. It's something to warm you up. It's something to get you into the mindset. And also, I would want you to do a speaking warm-up. Maybe you call someone real quickly, like a friend or a mentee or something, so that the interviewer is not the first person you talk to that day. Again, you're not just being assessed for your coding skills, but for communication skills. So make sure you're a little warmed up in that regard. There are theater warm-up techniques that you could potentially look at. It's just an idea. Cool. And then what I personally do just before the interview is, because I get hyped up, I'm like, okay, I'll pick up one funny book, or I'll look at a great interview, something like that, just something funny and relaxing to get me into a bit better mindset, right? Because you want to have a reasonable amount of adrenaline, but not the fight or flight kick in, not the close to panic attack, because that's not productive in a coding interview, right? So that's what I do. And I think it's a good spending of like 5 or 10 minutes of my time just before the interview. No last minute cramming. No last minute lookup on a data structure you didn't fully understand yet. That's not productive. You want to aim for long-term retention when you're studying, and you don't want to undermine your self-confidence just before the coding interview. And thus also, again, I'm going to highlight this, don't do a super hard coding problem just before the coding interview. Do an easy one, do a warm-up. Do one you already did maybe, right? Do just something to get you going. Maybe do some operations from your toolbox again or something like that, but don't do a hot one. During the interview, many questions, clarifications, ask if you want to elaborate, the usual stuff. I don't know this specifically, but I know this approach. I've mentioned this before. After the interview, the usual thank you note, and ask for feedback in time. And if you practice with people, ask for feedback right away, right? Cool. My perspective as an interviewer, I need you to be honest. I need to know what's on your CV and so on. These are the usual things that you find in any interview prep, not just for coding interviews, but again, a coding interview is an interview, so the same things that apply. I still assess you as a candidate, and not just as the code that you write, right? So if I see things that would dismiss you from a culture level, I would have to raise that, even though it's not my cup of tea usually. But if I see things that I think make you not a good data scientist, has nothing to do with the code, like if you say something, oh, I don't care about data privacy, and I'm like, well, wait a minute, that's a red flag, right? Let's talk about this. So yeah, just the usual things still apply. It's still an interview. So the usual things: be motivated, be as positive and confident as you can, and try not to think of the interview as your enemy. No, they're potential help, right? Cool. And I think that's it. Any questions? I'm gonna stop presenting. Yeah. Hello?
If anybody has any questions, feel free you can drop them into the chat or somewhere else as well.
I'll ask
I
couldn't see
one.
Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
So depending on the role, I mean, what's your general advice for, let's say you've got a coding interview coming up in a week, and it's going to be on Python stuff. Obviously, there's a difference between software engineering coding interviews and data science coding interviews. The data scientist is generally not going to be as good as software engineer as an actual software engineer. Do you have any resources for kind of getting up to speed? I mean, just personally, I know a lot about like pandas and NumPy and scikit-learn, but I can't really build out like implement classes from scratch or set up my own decorators, and I don't really know some of that kind of.
Wonderful question, and I think there's a long answer to this. So I apologize to people who have questions, because I want to go into this actually, because I think it's really important, and that is you probably should always, and I regret not having made this a more explicit point in the interview, ask about what the coding interview will be about. Because maybe they give you pointers as to it will be vanilla Python, it won't have pandas, it won't have this, it won't have that, and then you can focus on ramping up on the vanilla Python. That being said, maybe they won't tell you, that's okay, but then you should also have the perspective that it could be a data challenge where, yes, you'll have all the libraries that you always use, or, and I'm not a fan of this, but it happens a lot, it could be vanilla Python where it's none of the libraries that you use, where you have to do everything from scratch. Just be aware that's a thing, right? And these aren't necessarily, in my opinion, a great way to assess people, but that happens. And so what I would want you to do regardless, though, is I would want you to know the basics of how to build a class. So I think it's worth it for your long-term success even, not that you need to know it for the next interview, that's not it, but it's a good time of investment to know a bit about object-oriented programming, right? And yeah, class decorators and so on. You don't need to deep dive too deeply into it, but I would love for you to know things as, okay, what does a proper initialize function look like? What's the scope? How can I, set the state of an object of this class? How can I have an initial, state of each object, and so on? But that being said, I think those are two different things you can prepare for, right? One is the vanilla Python one, and also basic software engineering things. And yes, absolutely right. You won't have to meet the same expectations that you would have to meet for a software engineer. That's absolutely correct. But why not already know the basics of that, at least, right? Because you'll go into an interview and you'll show, yeah, I can do some object-oriented programming, or even if you don't have the time to do it, and even if you're not the expert at it, you can say, hey, usually I would look into how I could refactor this, maybe using an object-oriented approach so I won't pollute the namespace. Even if you just say a sentence like this, you score better than a lot of your competition. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
Cool. Another question.
Hong, I think.
Hey, Hong.
Yeah. Hey, hello. Thanks for the presentation. I wanted to ask, should you try and factor in the interviewer's potential background as well?
Why not? I mean, always research your interviewer. Sometimes you won't get to know who it is. It's don't overfit on it, right?
Okay.
But if there might be like an easy giveaway, and on top of this, let's face it, it's one human talking to another human. If there's a super easy way to connect, because you see someone's background as, hey, they're another SharpestMinds mentee, just one example, right? Or hey, they went to the same university. It's not manipulative. It's just building a network. The same thing you would do with another human being. Hey, I went to the same place. Right?
I was more talking in regards to the sort of questions that they might ask, because.
Yes, I was, yes, correct. I was getting to that too, but yeah. So the first step is you can always, anything you can use to build a connection, is just use that too. On top of that, yeah, if you can see that person is the head of data engineering, yeah, that can potentially affect what kind of questions they'll ask you. If that's a person that's very far removed from data engineering, that will probably affect what questions they'll ask you. So you can read into that, that's true, but don't overfit on it. Just because someone is the head of data engineering doesn't mean they don't know how to interview a data scientist, right? So yeah, if you were going to study more data operations and where to ramp up your SQL more, and you see that guy is a data engineer who's going to interview you, then yeah, maybe spend a bit more time than you would have on that stuff too. But don't overfit on it, right?
The rule of thumb I've historically used when I'm doing things like this is I'll give myself a budget of 2 blog posts that the person's written. So just to kind of give me an idea for okay, what biases, what lens does this person see the world through? And every once in a while, I'll land on something where I just connect to it, and I'm like, okay, I need to create an opening to start talking about that, and it might also affect how they parse your code. How they kind of evaluate it.
Yeah, I think that's fair. That's good. Don't overfit on it, right? I think you have enough on your plate. Don't play private detective, and But if there might be an easy signal that you might miss if you don't at least look them up on LinkedIn, right? So always do that. That's always a good investment. 2 to 3 minutes of your time. And then if you find something cool, look that up. And hey, maybe they research something that you're interested in. Maybe they also have an econ background or something like that. Then yeah, why not? That's always good. Again, it's an interview after all, right? Cool. More questions. I can take like one more, and then I need to run.
I think Kevin has one.
Yeah.
Cool. Hey, Kevin.
I wanted to ask a quick question. So there was a
Yeah.
time I had an interview, and the interviewer asked me to use a specific data structure.
Uh-huh.
In this case, it was a SQL function to use it to solve a question, but I didn't know it beforehand, so I've never used it before.
Uh-huh.
What would I tell the interviewer in this case? Would I just be honest? I don't know.
Yeah,
how to use
yes.
that?
It's a great sign to show honesty, and also what's the alternative? Fail trying to pretend? Yeah, I would, if it was me, and it could happen that I don't know the data structure that I'm supposed to use, I would say, I'm sorry, I have not used this data structure before. But let's say, hey, here's a linked list. I want you to implement it using a linked list. I mean, I have used a linked list before. Let's assume I have not used a linked list before. Say, I don't know, I have not used a linked list before. I have a vague idea of what it is. If you know what it is, if not, you say that I don't even know. I think I could implement it with a hash table. I think I could implement it with just a list of lists or something like that. Just say that then, right? But let them know that, because you don't really have an alternative, in my opinion. On the other hand, and I want to say this too, if I'm interviewing someone and I feel like they're bullshitting me, it's the end of the interview. It's over. I can't work with someone in the future who's dishonest, right? So be honest. It'll also help you just strategically, right? And also think about it this way. You're going to work with that person. You want these people to think, I want to work with that person. And strategically for the interview, again, think about how you could hack it out in brute force. And if you can't, you can't, right? And who knows, maybe you will get hints, and maybe you can work with your interview, and it can still be a successful coding interview in the end. And that's great, because sometimes you get one of these hard questions where you won't be able to answer it right away, right? It just happens, okay? Especially with coding interviews, there's so many random things that could be thrown at you. But if you have a brute force or any kind of approach, you can speak about that. And if you get your hand held even, and he walks you through, but he already likes you, or it's you already come highly referenced, as in that person's really awesome. Just if they don't do terribly in a coding interview, we're going to take them. If you already come with that kind of signal, and they're willing to work with you, and you're constructive, you're taking, you're receptive of what they say, you show like that you can collaborate with someone, you can write code with someone else. As I say, it's not just about you solving that problem. It's about how do you communicate, how do you do problem solving, what's your flow like? Can I work with you? This all gets assessed. This might be more important than the fact whether or not you can solve that problem right now, right? And your honesty is crucially important here, because otherwise you won't make it that journey then, right?
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Okay. I need to run. I have a work meeting right now with a client, unfortunately. But I want to say this. If you have any feedback or any suggestions, please feel free to just ping me on Slack. And if you have something that I think I missed, or if you have something that you think you want me to go in depth, just let me know. I'll gladly do that. And yes, I'd be happy to connect. And good luck in your coding interviews. And feel free to reach out to anyone and me if you have questions, right? Cool.